Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to an in-depth look at sports gambling presented by SBRnet and Sports Market Analytics. I'm joined today by my co-host, John Michaels, so I'll give you a chance to meet John a little bit better. But first, what I'd like to do is I'd like to thank both Ron Seaver and, of course, Mitch for helping us get on there, helping us get this all set up, and helping us, with this entire process. They do a great job with the National Sports Forum, and we're really excited to be a part of it. All of the data that you're going to see today that we're going to be presenting is going to originate from the 2022 annual study of sports fan habits and behaviors that we do at SBRnet. We've been doing this study, since 2012. We have great trending data that we're able to provide across a wide variety of categories and a wide variety of areas. What I'd like to do, of course, start out by introducing myself. Some of you may know me from other sessions that we've attended, but I have over 2 decades of experience specifically in sports business research. Been working in a variety of different applications, quantitative, qualitative, participation data, fan data. So we are really at the forefront, and I am really kind of knee deep and ankle deep in our data. Mark Sullivan, many of you may know him from the running event as well as other media and trade events. Mark is my partner, and we were lucky enough to acquire the business about 2 years ago. And as you can see on the right, we cover a wide variety of data all about sports fans and all about sports. And today I'm joined by an old friend, although an old friend not so old, Michaels from Sightline Payments. Jonathan, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background?
Thank you very much, Neil. Appreciate everybody joining us today. Sightline is based in Las Vegas, so I won't say good afternoon because some of you might be on the West Coast. I serve as Sightline Payments Senior Vice President of Strategic Development and Government Affairs. I've been in that role for about 18 months now. We are a leading fintech company who specializes in the gaming industry. Think anytime you go on a sports betting site, in the cashier page, our Play Plus solution is live with pretty much every legal sports betting operator in the U.S. Prior to joining Sightline, I spent about 7 years at the American Gaming Association, where I covered a number of areas, including sports betting. So really excited to be with you all today. I would say we have an hour for this session. Please feel free to ask questions, because if it's just Neil and I talking the entire time, we could go down a lot of rabbit holes.
And believe me, John and I have had a lot of conversations, not just about sports gambling, but about a lot of things in sports. And we have gone down a lot of holes together. And sometimes we just end up shaking our heads. But as I said, I want to talk a little bit about the data and SBRnet and our fan study more specifically. We cover 18 sports, 65 categories of data, and we provide 5 years of historical data for trending purposes. And we can provide that data in a wide variety of different formats. We cover everything from fan demographics and mobile device usage to things like sports gambling, as well as sports travel and just a wide variety of areas. Sample size of our data, it's a consumer-based study, 6,400 consumers ages 13 and above. So it's very large sample size, allowing you to be able to take the data down to smaller component or more granular pieces. So again, when we start talking about sports gambling, we have just an incredible volume of data for everything from both professional sports, college sports, amateur sports. So today, we're going to be talking about sports gambling. No surprise there. And, currently about half the states are allowing, John, I've got that right. It's about 25 states or somewhere in that area? No.
First time I'm telling you you're wrong today.
Yeah,
35 states have legalized. There are about 30 that are up and running. A mix of states that allow for mobile, some states that allow just for retail. But as part of my role is tracking all of that fun legislation as it passes through state houses across the country.
So as more states come online, there's an abundant supply of what I like to call low-hanging fruit or new customer opportunities. And it's real easy right now as these new states come on board, bringing on that low-hanging fruit. I have to tell you, I experienced something very similar very early in my career. When I first got out of school, I went to work for Comcast. And I remember, cable was in its infancy at that time. And I remember, we were able to sell cable TV, just go after the easy stuff and the low-hanging fruit. But I also remember what happened as time went on. We had to go and be a little bit more marketing-oriented, marketing-centric, learn how to market to specific targets and specific demographics. So once that low-hanging fruit is locked up, where are the next sets of sports gamblers coming from? And that's something that we really hope to focus on today. By the way, if today's presentation sounds a bit like a podcast, well, that's because we kind of set it up that way. The big difference is that you'll be able to see the data, see John and I, and review all the main topics. We're going to talk about a bunch of different things. We're going to talk about live attendance and the sports gambling business. We're going to talk about which sports are generating the dollars. We're going to talk about sports gambling by the generations, who's betting on what. We're going to do some more low-hanging fruit, and also the potential of a term that John coined for me, underserved markets. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. We're going to talk about women and sports gambling, gambling on women's sports, and then sports gambling. John also, second screen. We're going to talk about how that is so important when marketing sports gambling. And, of course, we're going to talk a little bit about John's area, which is, of course, cashless payments and its effect on the sports gambling ecosystem. Now, before I start with data, the one thing I want to say is that we are going to be looking at people, not looking at dollars or revenue. So some of the things you're going to see might be a little contradictory to some of the things because most of the companies report revenue. And look, it's revenue you take to the bank, but you need people to generate the revenue. So we're going to be looking at people, we're going to be looking at sports, we're going to be looking at opportunities. So let's get started. So sports gambling, what we're seeing is that it is growing overall, but it is not what I would call even across the board. We're seeing gambling up 18.4% year over year. Women's sports gambling growing much faster. In fact, women's sports gambling growing at twice the rate. So what we're looking at here are number one, 20 versus 2021 across the series of sports. These are not all of the ones we measure. We do cover 18 sports. So if you don't see your sport here, let me know and we can help you provide that data to you. But I just took a small sampling just for this particular purpose. But what we're seeing is that sports like auto racing, both NASCAR and IndyCar, golf and tennis, are seeing some nice gains after you get across that first tier of leagues. Hey, John, now that we're back into live events, what are you seeing with respect to sports gambling? Would you say that live attendance is driving a lot of this growth, or is there something else going on?
Certainly, I think the answer to that is yes, right? People like going to events. It's been something we've all missed, but we all are looking at our phones the entire time, right? Sports betting is a nice complement to that. You see this data and you're saying only up 18%. So as Neil said, remember it's people. So 18% in terms of increasing gamblers. Certainly the revenue numbers are dramatically higher than that as more and more states come online. So to kind of high level this, so about 4 years ago last week, the Supreme Court decided to invalidate a law called the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act, PASPA. What that enabled states to do was decide whether or not they wanted legal sports betting or not. As mentioned earlier, 35 states, it was pretty much only Nevada that had it pre-2018. So 34 more states have said, yes, we want this. It's really the fastest expansion of gambling in U.S. history. But what you're seeing, certainly from your categories in the sports world, is sports betting is a huge sponsorship opportunity. And you're seeing this pop up in any manner of things, whether it's professional, TV, web, even into college now. And what you're really seeing, though, is how do you leverage that in-person experience? So what we have, Neil, if you want to go back just one slide real quick on that, it is one of our partners is a company called GeoComply. So anytime you use a sports betting app, it needs to geolocate you. GeoComply is pretty much the brand name in that space. They looked at opening day in New York. First year that New York has had legal mobile sports betting, launched in late January. They looked at opening day for the Mets and the Yankees in terms of, okay, were people betting from the game? So what they found was at Citi Field, I'm a Met fan, just so we're very clear, about 4,000 unique individuals logged into accounts. That accounts for about 1 in every 10 people that attended the game. For the Yankees, there were about 2,600 unique logins, so about 1 in every 20 went there. But what they also found, in addition to just a sizable proportion of the attendance and attendees, looking at wagering, they found they looked at what interaction there was between the games, people attending them, and the rest of the market. And what they found was that fans who are attending a game are 6 times more likely to engage with sports betting than those that aren't. So it's really a significant driver, and certainly as you're looking at sponsorship categories, that's a way to engage fans that are attending your events.
John, didn't we see that Met fans outperformed the Yankee fans on opening day?
Of course they did. That's what 1 out of every 10 Met fans is a sports bettor. Only 1 out of every 20 Yankee fans.
Yeah, we'll see how they do at the end of the season, though, with wins and losses before I'm willing to kind of give props out on that. But what we wanted to look at here are the total percent of fans that gamble by sport. Now, this looks at the entire scope of all 18 sports that we cover. And the first thing that drops off the page to me is that MMA, smaller niche sport, does have the highest percentage of people who gamble on sports. And that's not just gambling on MMA, that's gambling on all sports. But we see Major League Soccer, international soccer, esports. Wow, don't get me started talking about esports and gambling, because that's a real, genuine opportunity. I just want to say one thing about the NFL. Well, they may have the lowest percentage, they have the most number of people. So it's always important when you're looking at percentages and looking at total number of people to put everything into perspective. So, John, we're seeing some gambling activity out of what I know you like to call niche sports. Do the big gambling platforms tend to go after the easy win with the big NFL, big NFL numbers, or are they going after the more, narrow wins, let's say, and is there room for everyone or every sport?
Well, certainly, I think what you see from nearly every sport is how do we optimize our product to be relevant to sports gamblers? You saw in the pandemic times a little more than 2 years ago, Colorado saw a huge increase in people betting on Russian ping pong. Why did they bet on it? Because there were no other live sports to bet on, right? But I think what you'll start to see, and now pretty much all the major books will offer lines on all of these. What you really need to look at is what are called markets on these. So the one that everyone always looks to is the Super Bowl. You have a bajillion props. You could bet on pretty much anything. And many people do, including the coin toss, length of the national anthem, all of that stuff. But what you see from some of these smaller sports, MMA, IndyCar, NASCAR, things like that, is books that can offer more markets and be a bit better in their pricing, really have an opportunity to compete with some of the larger books. Because certainly, FanDuel, DraftKings, BetMGM, Caesars, those are the really the big four in this space. And as you look downstream, the only way that a lot of these books will be able to survive is if they find niche opportunities to differentiate themselves. And, as you see here, there's some real opportunity. Soccer, I always point to, the highest percentage of fans who gamble on any sport are soccer fans. So it really speaks to how do you engage those fans in a meaningful way.
So, as John and I were talking about this, one of the terms that came up was underserved. But before we get into that, the graph that we're looking at shows the comparison of sports fans in blue to sports fans that gamble in orange. And we looked at first male, female, and then we looked at it by generation, Gen Z, millennial, Gen X, and of course me, baby boomers. But the graph shows that about 48% of sports fans are female, but only about 28% of them gambled in the last year. So women's sports gamblers are growing at twice the rate. But this would lead you to think that there is a bunch of what I like to call white space with respect to women's sports gamblers. And as John taught me, how do you serve the underserved market? So, John, you and I talk about sports gambling operators and using that term, how integrating or working or, attracting some of the underserved markets. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and what some of the operators are doing and what you're doing also in your specific area?
Sure. I mean, I think the data here says it all, right? Men love betting on sports. That, there are always going to be, men that folks are going to attract, but women are a real opportunity. And whether that be with, offering markets on women's sports, Neil shows the data at the bottom there going twice the rate. There were articles in Front Office Sports this week, Forbes last week, about women signing up at a higher rate than men for sports books. And, I think one of those things that you're going to start to see more of is how do you, demystify sports betting, right? Minus 110, plus 4.5. What are parlays? What is, over unders, all that sort of stuff. And if you don't understand it, you're just going to say, I'm not going to worry about this. But how do you essentially translate that for somebody who's interested in that? And it might be a $10 or $20 bet on an NFL game or an NBA game or WNBA game or World Cup game or whatever it may be. But you have to give that experience something where they get it. Now, what you also see here, right, is, the average sports bettor is someone who looks exactly like me, right? Mid-30s, college educated, reasonably affluent. And that fits with that millennial track and what the Gen X track is. Boomers like Neil, you don't have to worry about them if you're engaging in sports betting. To me, when I saw this data, I was actually pretty pleased at the Gen Z side because, that's where you might see a lot of problem gambling behavior begin to crop up, because essentially 25 is when your brain is fully formed and in terms of maturity. So that's why you see a lot of, college age kids with overall addiction issues, including gambling addiction. So to me, that audience, there's a real responsible gaming and education opportunity, but they're not gambling at a higher rate or at a similar rate to some of their older peers.
John, your parents would be really proud of you putting that Maryland education to good use there, talking about underdeveloped brains in the Gen Z and all that. So I was very impressed there. So I thought as an example, I would narrow down our focus and look at a specific case. Now, again, I narrowed it down, but in this case, I chose basketball. And I chose the NBA, the WNBA, and men's college basketball. Now, look, we cover 18 sports. We just couldn't do all of them. The charts would have been like bizarre. So in terms of fans who bet on the surveyed sport, the WNBA is not lacking compared to the NBA or college basketball when it comes to sports gambling. In fact, the WNBA has a slight edge in this case. In 2021, 21.9%, let's say 22%, of WNBA fans placed a bet, as opposed to 19.6%, rounded up a little to 20, of NBA fans who placed a bet. And about the same number for college basketball, or about 21%. So even, when looking at fandom, fan retention, for the NBA, it's a much smaller sport in terms of the number of fans, but they have and they present a wonderful gambling opportunity for betting on women's sports. Now, fans are interested in betting on games. They go out and bet on games. So it's simply just on a smaller scale. But there are no deterrents that I can see other than, as John mentioned a little bit, the education factor when it comes to growing this underserved market. But there are really two sides to the women's gambling coin. First, you have women's sports gamblers that gamble on sports. And then you have women betting on women or men betting on women. Now, even if fandom and fan retention of the NBA is lower, they do have the highest percentage of fans that do gamble on sports. So in looking at this from that perspective, I see and I look at this as an immense opportunity for operators and women betting on sports. And the fact that the rate of new sports gamblers coming onto platforms is twice as high for women as it is for men. So really, it's a great opportunity. John, we've looked at women and the big opportunity that is out there with women's sports gambling. What other groups are you focusing on to grow the sports gambling category?
Well, I think even speaking to this, right, and today was an historic day in the U.S. with, U.S. soccer essentially finally providing pay parity for the men's and women's national teams. And I think, you see women's sports as a whole. I think they're undervalued from a media perspective. The Women's College World Series outdraws in terms of viewership the Men's College World Series. You heard everything last year with the women's Final Four versus the men's Final Four. As more and more properties focus on that, there'll be more opportunities for events on television and more bettors in turn. One of the areas I think you also see a big opportunity, we looked at soccer earlier, is the Latino market. There really isn't a native U.S. sports book that caters to that audience. Interestingly enough, you've seen a Mexican company called Caliente, who's been granted a mobile-only license in the state of Illinois and spending real money to go there. That's a prime example of that. There's a company in Las Vegas called JefeBet that is launching as well to try to serve that population, because certainly they are huge soccer fans. I mean, Liga MX is massive and much bigger in terms of viewership and fandom than the MLS is here in the U.S. So I think that's a real opportunity for some more of these smaller books to say, how do we engage that population? And certainly the language barrier there is huge too.
So, we're going to keep on this niche or the underserved a little bit. So when analyzing what we like to call, or I like to call, cross-generational trends, or the percentage fans that have gambled in the past 12 months for each of the three respective sports we're using in our little case study here, we see very little difference at the rate each generation gambles. Roughly 12% of WNBA bettors are members of Gen Z, which is also highest, I might add, when it comes for the NBA and college basketball. On the other hand, Gen Xers, that bet on the WNBA gamble at a much lower rate. So really, we are seeing some generational differences, uniqueness, and we really need to understand how each generation consumes sports betting. So, John, when we talk about the opportunities that are presented and challenges for sports gambling, what are some of the various strengths you are seeing with some of the challenges or the strengths within the various generations that you see out there and marketing to them? I know we talked about Gen Z, and millennials being the all mobile generation.
Yeah, certainly you have that. And in a lot of states, or not in a lot, in a few states, you also have cross-sell opportunities between sports betting and online casino. That's really where Gen X would play a little more into that, because casino games or particularly online casino games are likely to be more interesting to them. Certainly as we were looking through this, Gen X looking at college basketball more than some of the other ones was a bit surprising to me. And but I think overall what you see is really that 25 to really 45-year-old, generally male customer is the core. But how do you grow beyond that in terms of your 21 plus pop? It would be interesting to see, and there are only a handful of stadiums that have this today. Are retail sports books in stadiums an interesting way to engage boomers, right?
Right.
You look at Major League Baseball. They have, I believe, the oldest fan population. But, if you go and say, I think, Jacob deGrom is going to strike out 10 folks for the Mets when he gets off the IL in a couple weeks, you might put $10 or $20 on that at a retail sports book in venue. Right now, you have those in Arizona. You have those in Washington, D.C. Ironically, Capital One Arena here a couple miles from where I am in DC was the first U.S. stadium to have a sports book in it. It's a beautiful Caesars sportsbook facility, but I think you have to find ways to engage different audiences where they are. Millennials are very mobile centric. Boomers, not as much, but there are still opportunities to engage them because they're still very interested in watching sports. They're huge fans of sports, and they might throw a couple bucks on a game.
So let's move on to our case study a little bit. And we're talking a little bit about betting on the WNBA. And there's really nothing unique about how bets are being placed or where they're being placed. We see the U.S. casino, sports books, online sports books, doing about 50% of the betting or the bets on women's sports these days, well over 50%. John, I hate to admit it, but I've been making sports bets through a bookie for some time before the advent of online gambling platforms. John, I know that pretty much you were in the same boat, before the advent of online sports gambling. So if anyone wants to hear about my experiences in sports gambling, I do have kind of a funny anecdote from when I was at Syracuse. But back to my point, men have been conditioned. Men have, it's been ingrained a little bit more into our DNA, so to speak. Most women have not had that predisposition. Is that an opportunity or is that a challenge? Or both?
Well, I think it's both. And right, Neil, when you were doing the bookie stuff at Syracuse, they were actually good at football. So that's how long.
Thanks for outing me on that.
But essentially, there are a couple things that are really important here. One is education. So you see on this, bookie or offshore online sports book, there are a lot of things with that consumers just don't know what is legal versus what is illegal. I live in the state of Maryland. Maryland has authorized mobile sports betting sometime in the, hopefully near future, we'll get it. But I can go online right now and find any number of sites where I can deposit funds and bet. And I know what those are, which ones are legal and not, but the average consumer does not. Now, the challenge with a lot of those sites, right, is because they are not legal to operate in the U.S., they have no responsible gaming safeguards. So in a little bit, we'll talk about, the 13 to 17-year-old. They don't care if you're 13 years old and signing up for one of these accounts. As long as your money is good, you're good to go. It is very, very difficult for underage, under 21 or under 18, depending on jurisdiction, to wager on sports.
I don't want to let the cat out of the bag too much, but we are going to talk a little bit about that in a couple of slides. So, John, let's hold off on that for a minute. But, what I wanted to also say was that in the SB Arnett study of sports fans, we do ask the specific platform that people use for online sports betting. Now, I want to say a couple of things. Number one, we're talking about people, not dollars. So it really is, important to understand that while revenue goes to the bank, has to start with people. And we measure people. We do not measure revenue. That's for the, I'm going to leave that for the financial community. So, while some may say, well, FanDuel has bigger market share. In this case of the WNBA, we are showing DraftKings actually outperforming FanDuel just for the WNBA and just for people. And I know that both FanDuel and DraftKings are doing a great job. BetMGM, Caesars. We even look at what's coming through Barstool. But John, what are some of the marketing strategies that the various betting platforms are implementing, to grow gamblers or to grow women gamblers? Are they doing anything different? Let's put it that way.
I mean, right now, what you're seeing in most jurisdictions, and I live in a market because Virginia is alive and legal with mobile sports betting, where I get served a lot of sports betting ads. It's very bonus heavy right now, and certainly one of the other things that a lot of people are talking about is just the overall volume of advertising. My former colleagues over at the American Gaming Association have created a public service campaign called Have a Game Plan, designed to talk about responsible betting and things like that. But there are lots of concerns around the sheer volume of advertising and kind of what people are saying. I've spoken on panels before about the need for the industry to have more responsible gaming centric ads you see, from the liquor industry, come to like Captain Morgan, they have the Captain Morgan water break. And certainly one of the things there is also the industry needs to be proactive in talking about this before government says you're going to have to curtail some of these advertisements. And but really it's that those bonuses that draw folks in right now. There are lots of risk-free bets, they're called, and that's another area that the regulators might have their sights on. But certainly the other area that we see a lot of volume coming in through is affiliate marketing. This is really big in Europe for sportsbooks. And certainly the U.S. has turned into a great market for that as well, where you see websites that are serving bonuses and reviews towards different groups, groups like Catena Media, American Affiliate, Better Collective, those sorts of folks.
So what I'd like to do now would be to zoom out a little bit. We've zoomed in, I want to zoom out. So, we talked earlier about generational opportunities. And if we look at this graph, clearly what we see is both millennials and Gen X overperforming the average of 14.1% of all sports fans that are gambling. Again, as I said, millennials and Gen X overperforming, but we see Gen Z and the boomers underperforming. My guess is that they're going to leave the boomers alone because, let's face it, people like me are kind of aging out of everything. I hate to use that expression, but it's true. And I know John will bust my chops about it. But, what do you think can be done, John, to be able to maybe attract more or get more engaged with Gen Z?
Well, you mentioned earlier, esports. It's a huge opportunity. There's a huge audience in that now. The challenge with that is also some of the, we'll call it gambling aspects of esports are questionable. Say loot boxes is something that gets thrown around a lot as a challenge for the industry and from a regulatory perspective. And, as those Gen Z folks age into graduating college, having more disposable income, I certainly think that esports is going to be something that's very interesting to them. And yeah, I mean, with the boomers, right, you talked about the age out concept. I do believe retail could be a good opportunity to engage those folks because, people like you, Neil, you've made bets plenty of times. Might not be online, but you made bets. But we do have a question from the audience, so I want to make sure we ask that one as well.
John, we've got a question from the audience about, do you think there's an allegiance in the sports gambling industry to a specific book, or are consumers just bouncing from book to book, finding the best deal, the best promo possible, or does brand loyalty even come into play in the sports gambling business?
Great question. I would say there are differences in all of those. So one, it's not easy to sign up for a sports betting account. You have to go through a KYC effort, usually uploading some kind of document like your driver's license. And it takes a while. And then from there, you have to fund the account, which is kind of where our company comes into that. So that's not an insignificant process. So I think at the outset, you see a lot of people that are bonus shopping. There was a panel that I listened to in New Jersey this week where a New Jersey sports bettor, if they played everything the right way, could get nearly $14,000 in bonuses. So some players are doing that. Longer term, I think folks are going to select one or two books they like because they have money in there. They like the interface. The odds are fair. Here in Washington, D.C., there is a lottery run monopoly called Gambet that's run through a lottery company called Intralot. And you see the odds and you're like, they're not good odds. People know that. So if you're getting fair odds, good, quick payouts, I would say that's another big thing. What we found in research and a number of others have shown this. The number one reason a customer selects a sports book is fast payouts. You want access to your money, right? But what I think you're going to start to see, and this is where the MGMs and Caesars and even Barstools of the world, because they're owned by Penn National Gaming, is they're going to find ways to link the brick and mortar casino experience with the digital sportsbook experience. Single loyalty, single account, ability to use your funds across those, ability to earn loyalty across those, where that's really going to engage their audiences. So good question.
So John and I, when we were preparing this, we talked about something called the second screen. And I'm going to kind of go through because I think this is a little bit of kind of the obvious, but the blue line looks at total sports fans while the orange line represents fans who gamble. And clearly, fans who gamble are more inclined to be very mobile centric. In fact, regular sports fans are about 78%, whereas sports fans who gamble are 90% more mobile in the way they place their bets. And I don't think there's really a lot of surprise here. But John, we did talk about the second screen and really how it's developed into a big tool or a big part of the growth of online sports gambling. Is there anything you want to kind of add to it, or but I think this data does say a lot. We're going to talk, by the way, a little bit about TikTok and Snapchat in a minute.
Well, right. And I think if you're looking from a marketing perspective, how do you reach those audiences? So baseball is a great example of a sport that has a lot of built-in breaks. I was listening to the Mets, who were they playing? The Cardinals last night. And, in between innings, you'll go online. And Twitter's a great source of information and news on that. So that's my preferred social media site when I'm in between innings. But you'll look and see what's going on with different things. Are they bringing in a new pitcher? Is somebody hurt? You see a lot around like the NFL draft. There was a lot of talk about people that had information about a certain draft pick going number one and then betting that before the books could adjust their line. So, information is power. Certainly we all look at our second screen all the time, but it's really, how do you engage those different audiences? And certainly there's gambling Twitter and all sorts of other things that are out there, but it's what are you using to engage that audience while they're just sitting there, whether it be idle time in between innings or even, in between batters.
So we took a look at, I talked a little bit about TikTok and Snapchat. And what's interesting is I wanted to do this thing I called the likelihood of gambling by social media platforms. So for instance, 49.4% of TikTok users are more likely to gamble on sports. Same number for Snapchat. We talked a little bit about younger fans going after that Gen Z younger audience. John, I think this might bode really well for that opportunity.
Absolutely. If you're not looking at Snapchat and TikTok as an opportunity, you're missing audience. So the Twitter comment that I made, nearly 40% there, but some of the other options, not as much. But I think some of the things with Snapchat and TikTok, they're fast. They're able to engage people really easy. So it provides a real opportunity for engagement.
So as John and I were talking a little before, we talked a little bit about underage sports gambling. And I wanted to talk a little bit about it because this is one of those times where, as a researcher, sometimes numbers can be a little deceiving. So when I looked at gambling underage, and for us, underage was 13 to 17 years old. I wasn't able to break it down, John, even maybe a little bit, more for, let's say, 13 to 20. I mean, I probably could have done it, but didn't have the time. But when we looked at underage, we saw there's about 600,000 sports fans or sports gamblers that were between the age of 13 to 17. When I first saw that, a red flag went up. But John, after you and I spoke yesterday, we realized that it was only about 1.3% of all sports gamblers. So does the number of 600,000 bother you in any way? Does the underage sports gambling situation bother you? Look, I'm a parent, I'm a grandparent. I know you're a parent. While there are a number of safeguards in place, and we've talked about it, we both know that you're never going to be able to block out all underage people from doing sports gambling. But what are some of the things that you are doing? And I know this may give you a little chance to jump on your soapbox a little bit.
Well, listen, education is paramount here. Understanding, especially at that age, what this is and that it can lead to harm or problems. Certainly within that audience, I'm sure you see a huge number of fantasy sports players as well.
Yes.
And a lot of people are saying, well, between all these ads and all this, we're just conditioning kids to gamble. And quite honestly, Neil showed me this data and, it was kind of headless at the outset. And as we went through and found it's 1.3%. Certainly you'd love to see that number be zero. but we know that's really not possible. I would be surprised if that 600,000 was materially higher than it was 5 years ago before the PASPA decision was handed down, because that's a pretty low number in terms of the overall population. But making sure that this audience, high schoolers, know the dangers of gambling is important. But it also is a huge distinction between the legal regulated market and the illegal offshore market, where legal regulated market, if somebody allowed a 15-year-old to get on their platform and gamble, they would get fined. They might even lose their license and ability to operate. Whereas for the offshore books, they're not doing age verification. They don't have any regulatory, oversight that tells them this is what you need to do. So it's also another way that, making sure people know the difference between legal regulated books and illegal offshore books is paramount.
So, John, what I want to do, and we're wrapping up here, we're down to our last two things, and I want to talk a little bit about market share of sports gambling platforms. And remember, we're talking people, not revenue. I know I've said that at least 6 times. John's smiling over there because I know, it's better. It's generally known that FanDuel does higher revenue, but our data shows that from a people perspective, because I've said that enough times. We're looking at maybe it's a little bit different, a little bit more flipped. And of course, look, it can be. But here's the question I want to ask, John. If we look past the top 5 market share grabbers, DraftKings, FanDuel, BetMGM, Caesars, and Barstool, do you expect to see some consolidation from among all of the other smaller or single-digit market share players in the industry?
Absolutely. I mean, you've even seen some of it already. So Golden Nugget recently was acquired by DraftKings. So you could kind of take those off. But I think what you're going to start to see, certainly as the market has shifted. So if you look, this time last year, all the gaming stocks were rip-roaring because they were able to sell that long-term profitability story. We're burning through cash like crazy. Transition to today, one of my good friends, a guy by the name of Chad Bynan, he's an analyst with Macquarie Securities, was on a panel last week pretty much saying, if you don't have a path to profitability, Wall Street's not going to value you worth anything. And as a result of that, people are going to have to constrain their marketing budgets, or they're going to have to band together to gain scale. And certainly one of the big challenges in the U.S. market, there's a federal act called the Wire Act, which doesn't allow companies to really scale their business. You can't do what's called layoff wagering over state lines. It certainly impacts our business from a payments perspective as well. But essentially, if you can't get to that 8 to 10% share number, it's really difficult to make money long-term in these markets.
Sure.
And certainly the street is not going to tolerate companies that are just burning cash.
So we're in the home stretch, and I thought the last thing I wanted to do is, I like to answer a lot of different questions. I like to answer the who, the what, the when, the why, the where, the how. One of the things that one of my analysts and I were talking about is I asked them, what are the most important indicators within our, data stream or our data fields, let's just say, for most of the major sports? What are those 10 most critical factors? On the left, you see what they are. We have played fantasy sports, use Snapchat daily, use TikTok daily, attend 5 or more games live, use YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, spent $50 or more on licensed apparel. Hey, there's some real interesting crossover there. I wouldn't discount that so quickly. Or how influenced are sports gamblers by sponsorship messaging? So we went across the board, and you can read this both horizontally or vertically. So from a vertical standpoint, let's go to one of my favorite sports, golf. In fact, I played golf early this morning. So if you're looking at golf, for golf, playing fantasy sports was the number 5 most critical attribute, whereas use TikTok daily, interesting, it was the number 1 attribute. So again, what are the most critical factors when it comes to understanding and reaching sports gamblers? Because each one clearly has a different path. John, This tells me there are so many possible sponsorship, marketing partnerships to be made and to be had for sports gambling platforms. Do you see this as one way that operators, especially those that have smaller market share, can grow their business?
Well, I think it's both the smaller operators, but also from the sports side, it's knowing your customer. Where are they? The biggest thing that stuck out to me, if you look down the NFL line, NFL by far the most wagered upon sport.
Of course.
Fantasy sports, they're last, which would be counterintuitive to most of what I would think. But you go to that first question that Neil asked and about in-person attendance, attend 5 or more games, number 2 factor there. So NFL fans who attend a lot of these games are interested in betting on them. So if you're looking at ways to engage fans, how do you do those activations? And, I'm a New York Jets fan. Yes, long suffering. Let's not talk about it today. But, I went to a game to kind of look at how their activations go. And they have 3 different sports betting partners, all in different ways. But those partners are saying, we see this data. We want to invest in that game day experience because we believe it's a great way to reach our target audience.
So we're at the end. I want to thank everyone. Look, I know working with numbers can get a little bit dry, and hopefully this kind of bouncing back and forth with John and we were able to bring things a little bit more to life for everyone. Again, I want to thank Ron Seaver and his staff at the National Sports Forum. John, I really want to thank you for helping me out today. The last time I tried to recruit you to help me on a panel for sports gambling, your wife was expecting twins, and I know you've got twins in that house somewhere.
Yeah, well, they're almost a year old now, and it certainly changes things. But listen, Neil, and National Sports Forum, thank you, and to all of you attending today, thank you all for being here. Certainly, please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn if you have any questions. I don't know if we have a couple more minutes now, if there are any other audience questions, but thank you to everybody.
Yeah, and if you'd like to get some more information or you'd like to understand some of the data a little bit more in depth, please don't hesitate to reach out to me at neil@sbrnet.com or go on our website at www.sbrnet.com. Or, as John said, reach out to me on LinkedIn. Any way you want to reach out, go for it. So, again, I want to thank everybody at the NSF. I want to thank John. And that's all we got for today.
Thank you so much, everyone.